I am going to present our next speaker. I would like to welcome Jennifer Singh to the stage. Jennifer leads project management and strategy for Thomson Reuters with a focus on commercial strategy, business development, partnerships, and go-to-market efforts. She is also incubating a new business of identity verification services for Thomson Reuters. Jennifer will take us through a stimulating discussion on the emergence of digital identity and how the technology can be leveraged to assist across industries to stay ahead of those who wish to use our financial systems to conduct criminal activity and re-examine the rules of the road for transaction risk management in lieu of ongoing data breaches. And now I'd like to welcome Jennifer to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out here on such a terrible weather day. And thanks so much to Gina for a great introduction. So as Gina mentioned, I lead product and strategy for our new digital identity solutions business. And we're a group that was formed about a year ago within Thomson Reuters because we are seeing our customers struggle with identity verification, especially as they were transitioning more into digital services. Here we go. So our team was formed to create new products and solutions that help our customers address these pain points. So I'm here today to talk about digital identity, what it is, and what are some of the challenges that the industry is facing today. It's a bit of a complex topic, so I'm going to start from some of the basics and break down what is identity. From there, we'll go into the challenges and then start to talk about some of the solutions that we see and some of the institutions and enterprises that are starting to address this problem. Now, one of the reasons I absolutely love working in the identity space is the fact that identity is so personal. It's fundamental to who we are as individuals. So it's not just a professional problem, it's really a personal problem at the end of the day. And identity is super complex. There's all these different facets that make you who you are as an individual. Lots of pieces of the puzzle that come together that really inform who you are. It starts from birth. Who we are as individuals, we're unique when we appear in the world and we look different from the next baby. And as we grow, we get to become teenagers and basically are struggling to find ourselves and what is our identity in this world. And then maybe by the time we're adults, we might have figured that out. And maybe we have multiple identities, right? We have our work identity. We have our personal identity at home. Maybe you have a social identity. And then for some bad actors out there, some criminals, they might also have some fake identities. And we'll talk more about that later today. The key with identity is that it's really fundamental to how we get access to all the various services that we use on a daily basis. And identity is really central to everything that we do throughout our lives. A great example is my day yesterday. So I'm actually from Atlanta, and I made the journey to New York yesterday. And my day started out first thing in the morning. I always wake up, and I'm a little addicted to my smartphone. So the first thing I do is I check my email in the morning. Well, your email and access to your email is based on having a username and password that you set up early on, and that identity in your social profile actually gets you access to all your personal information in your email. From there, I called an Uber. And when I registered for my Uber account, it used a unique identifier to identify me as an individual. And that identifier was my phone number, right? I control that number. And then once I established my profile, I actually input some of my biographical information. So Uber now knows my name, my credit card number. And then over time, I also developed an identity around my social rating on the platform, right? Every time you go for a ride, the driver is able to rate you as an individual because they want to ensure that this is someone that should come back and actually continue to be a patron of your service. So you're building that profile and building that identity on that service. I finally get to the airport, and in order to get to your gate, you have to go through security, of course. Well, normally, you need to visit a TSA agent. And what do they ask for? They ask for your documentation and your boarding pass. And they're looking to identify you as an individual, make sure that you are supposed to be the person getting on the plane, and that your name and your face really matches your document at the end of the day. And there is a physical person there that's actually checking that information. Well, I've recently signed up for a service called Clear. How many of you in the room are familiar with Clear? A good amount. That's great. Well, for any frequent travelers, I highly recommend that you use the service. And what they're doing is, instead of using your documents to verify you as an individual, they're using your unique identifiers that are extremely unique to you, which is your biometrics. Things like your fingerprints, your palm prints, your facial recognition, an iris scan. And those unique identifiers can actually prove that I am, in fact, Jennifer Singh. And I no longer need to see a TSA agent to get my identity verified. Instead, I can skip that line and go directly to getting my bag screen. It's super, super fast and easy. So finally, I get to my hotel and I check in. And the first thing that they ask for is my ID and my credit card, right? Again, my identity is being checked in person using this physical documentation. So your identity is essentially your gateway, right? It's your gateway to access services. It's your gateway to get on planes. It's a gateway to get information and access to that information. So it's super core to everything that we do. So let's break it down a little bit and talk about what are some of the core aspects of your identity that make you an individual. Well, it starts off with some of your inherent traits, those things that you're actually born with at the end of the day. Things like your name, your biometrics, your birthday, and then there's some other traits about you that are your biographical information that don't seem to change very often. Things like your address, for example. And those biographical information is a lot of the types of information that's often used to verify you as an individual. But we all know that we're much more than just this information. Governments like to assert legal documentation on us as proof of our identities. Within the US, obviously, it starts with Social Security numbers, and those Social Security numbers give us then access to that legal documentation, your passports, your driver's licenses. And historically, that's always how we have proven our identity in physical environments. But the world is moving to digital, right? Everything we're doing is online right now. We're making purchases online, we're sending mail online. And so it's our digital attributes that are actually becoming very important to our identities as well. Our email address, for example, is often more used than your physical address these days to identify you. There are things like your IP address. Where are you logging in from? Different companies are using cookies and tracking your activity on the web so that they can understand, is this, typical for your behavior? Not on the slide, but also just as important are your social profiles. Your Facebook account, your Twitter handle, your Instagram account. That's a representation of who you are and what your identity is at the end of the day. And then finally, with the explosion of the Internet of Things, we have all these connected devices that are very personal to us, that are transmitting a ton of information and can tell and represent us as individuals. Things like your smartwatches, right? It's tracking where I'm going and how many steps I take a day. and is very representative of me as an individual. But we're also seeing this propagate as you have all the connected devices in your home as well. And then what's most interesting is with the explosion of big data, we can now use data to track your behaviors and identify you as an individual using typical behaviors that you use in your daily life. So the credit card companies were really great in pioneering behavioral tracking, and they can actually look at your credit card purchase history and identify, are there transactions that are maybe atypical for you as an individual, and flag that for fraud. We're now starting to see that behavioral type of identification expand into focusing on mobile devices. So I think most of us carry at least one device, if not two, and your device has become almost like another physical part of your body because it's always with you everywhere you go. And so it's just like having another hand, right? Another physical attribute next to you. But it's transmitting a ton of data. And that data is with you everywhere and can track your GPS history, where you're going, what you're looking at, and what you're doing at the end of the day. A new type of technology is also coming out around behavioral biometrics. And there's software companies that can actually put some software in your apps or on your device that can actually measure how you use your smartphone at the end of the day. How do you pinch? How do you zoom? What sort of pressure do you use when you type on your phone? And that can be used to identify you as an individual. And it's so exact, it can tell when I'm using my phone versus when maybe Gina has taken my phone and is trying to use my device. It's that powerful. So with all this information, we have it all at our fingertips. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to how do we use that information in order to verify the identity of an individual. As individuals, we always want to know who we're working with or who we're interacting with at the end of the day. Well, just like individuals, service providers, governments, institutions, entities, they all need to know also who they're doing business with, whether it's because of a compliance reason or just because it's good business. And there's two fundamental questions at the core of identity verification. We all want to know, are you a real person, and are you who you say you are? If we think about how we used to do business, a lot of it used to be in person, right? We used to go to a store. We used to open a bank account in a bank branch. And the process for verifying your identity was similar to seeing that TSA agent, right? You presented your documentation. They wanted to look at your face and make sure you matched your documentation. And if there were any questions, they could always, ask other verifying questions to assure that they know who they're doing business with at the end of the day. But this is becoming much more complex as businesses move into digital channels for a variety of different reasons. Now, when we think about the complexity, it can be as minute as the challenges that we personally face on a day-to-day basis, where we're managing tons of passwords and logins and all these different identities that we have online. I know some of them you might use every day and you'll remember that password, but what about the account that you only log in once a year? And then you have to go through the dreaded password reset in order to get access to something and actually conduct your business. There's also fundamentally really this big macro problem for many individuals in the world these days. And that's 1 in 7 individuals actually are unable to prove their identities. And this is for a variety of different reasons. Maybe they're born in impoverished conditions where they're outside of some of the government type of systems where identities are issued. Maybe they're refugees and they don't actually have a government that can issue an identity for them. You also have subjects of human trafficking or other criminal behavior, and those documents that really represent your identity are withheld from them. And so this is a huge issue that a lot of different forums, the World Economic Forum and other global institutions, are trying to solve. Because fundamentally, every human should be able to have access to various government services and just services to live. And what we're seeing is as these government services and your basic services move online, if you don't have any identity, you can't interact in person, let alone online. So what's causing this complexity? Well, as businesses shift from kind of in-person business to digital channels, they're not changing their approach to how they verify their consumers at the end of the day. And so they always start with this document-centric approach, right? They're always looking for your driver's license or your passport to prove your identity. But when you move online, you can't show someone your driver's license anymore. So they've tried to come up with processes that start to pick up some of the information on that document and try to verify that. So maybe your driver's license number or your address or your name and all your biographical information. But again, there's not a high degree of assurance that whoever's sitting behind that computer actually is the person who owns that document at the end of the day. How do they know it's me, Jennifer Singh, with my driver's license and not some bad actor who's stolen my driver's license or has access to my information at the end of the day? Fundamentally, there's all these sources of truth about our identity, right? Our passport number, it can be verified by the passport agency. Our driver's license number can ultimately be verified by the DMV. The post office can verify our current address. But the challenge with identity verification is, Bank XYZ can't go to all those sources of information and go to the truth at the end of the day, because all that information is extremely siloed right now. It sits in so many different buckets and so many different databases across the world. What you have instead are some aggregators who have been trying to pull together this information, things like the credit bureaus, for example. And they pull together that information and try to help these service providers identify individuals at the end of the day. But the problem with even these aggregators is a lot of this information isn't updated in real time. And what you see is, for anybody who's pulled your credit report recently, if you pull all three, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, you'll often see a lot of discrepancies between, the way they're tracking your information. Sometimes they might have a different address listed as your most recent address. Or for any of you in the audience who have changed your name ever, I have, and you'll notice that they probably have so many different names on your credit report. I'm Jennifer Etmeyer, which is my maiden name in some places. I'm Jennifer Singh in others. And sometimes they have my middle name in there or not. So if I'm a bank or another institution trying to verify Jennifer Singh, how do I know what's really the source of truth when I'm looking at all these different points of data, right? It becomes a really big data problem. And fundamentally, there's a true lack of trust in that data at the end of the day. So all this complexity makes it really hard to do business online. A great example is if you think about opening an online bank account right now. I don't know if any of you have done it recently, but especially if you go to a bank that is more of a typical traditional bank with bank branch locations. Their digital processes sometimes are good, sometimes need a little bit of help. But there was a survey that was done, and basically the results were that on average, it takes a consumer more than 10 minutes to fill out an application to open a bank account online. That's a pretty long time in today's day and age when we're always expecting things to happen very quickly. And not only that, but you also need to bring together a ton of different types of information, some of which you might be able to find easily, some of which, if you started at work, that application at work, you might have to wait and finish it at home because you have to go search for some physical documentation to find all that information. For those people, because it's so cumbersome, almost 20% of customers actually abandon the process along the way. And that's a significant loss of revenue for a bank at the end of the day, right? 20%, they could have had 20% more business. Now, of those customers that make it to the end of the application, almost 34% of those attempts are actually denied at the end of the day. So the bank doesn't have enough information, or there's enough conflicting information that they just don't have a high degree of assurance that this is the person that they say it is. And so they don't want to actually open that bank account. And instead, this is where banks, in many cases, will actually activate their omni-channel strategy. And they'll say, actually, can you go to the bank branch down the road and we'll finish your process at that point? Because they want to look at your physical documentation and make sure it is you at the end of the day. But if you guys are anything like me, I'm actually going to go try to open another bank account online before I get in my car and actually drive down to that bank branch. So it's a significant loss of revenue. On top of that, various institutions are facing a huge amount of fraud right now. And the fraud is coming in a lot of different modalities. I would love to see a show of hands in the audience. How many of you, since the beginning of this year, have gotten an alert from your credit card company about a potential fraudulent transaction? That's a lot. It happened to me 3 weeks ago. I woke up one morning and had a $5 charge from Hulu, which seems pretty innocuous and it's pretty small, right? Well, the fraudsters out there are trying to make small little purchases to test the waters, see if they can get away with it. And if they do, that's when they go on a really big spending spree. And so I was lucky. Visa caught the transaction, brought it to my attention, and they let it go. But somebody had to pay for that $5 transaction. And if you multiply that by the number of people who just raised their hands, that's a significant cost for a business to bear. On top of that, Visa had a cost of servicing me as a customer. They had to issue a new credit card. And I was actually on my way to Europe in a couple days. So I needed my card overnighted so I could use it when I was in Europe. And that's another significant cost that adds up over time. So the fraudsters are becoming really, really savvy, especially in these digital channels. We used to see a lot of physical credit card fraud, but with the rise of the EMV chips that are in credit cards now, it's a lot more difficult to do physical credit card fraud. So those fraudsters are now realizing they can get away with much more in digital channels. With mobile banking apps, you're seeing the rise of check fraud, where people are actually trying to scan checks and they're fraudulent and they're cashing checks. You have your traditional identity fraud, where people are just having their personal information stolen, and things like online purchases are made using your credit card numbers. But what's more scary is we're seeing the rise of synthetic identity fraud. And synthetic identity fraud is basically these fraudsters are creating people out of thin air. They take social security numbers or credit numbers that have never been used before. They might be sitting with the Social Security Administration unused, or sometimes they're Social Security numbers for people who don't have credit histories. And then they build some sort of online, identity around that fact. What's really scary is, well, if you think about who doesn't have credit histories these days, it's young people. People who have never applied for a credit card before. And we're seeing a lot of children's identities and their numbers actually being stolen and used for synthetic identity fraud. In addition to fraud costs, we're seeing all these institutions having to react to government regulations and compliance. I know other speakers today will probably get more into all the compliance aspects that banks and institutions are facing. But basically, the governments have woken up and said, you need to know who you're doing business with at the end of the day. And if you're not going to take the right procedures in order to have that assurance, we are going to fine you for that. So banks are increasingly being faced with extra costs around compliance or around fines that are pretty significant. The core of why these fraudsters are becoming so savvy and being armed with all this data is going back to those data breaches that were mentioned earlier today. It started off, a couple years ago, we started to hear about it here and there, Target, Home Depot, the various retailers. Well, the criminals realized that a lot of our personal information is all stored in centralized databases at these big companies. They have these big customer records where all of our personal information is all in one honeypot. And if they can just tap into that, they get access to all this rich information. Last year, we really saw a fever pitch being reached. Data breaches were up almost 45% over the year before. And of course, we're all familiar with the Equifax breach. And that one's particularly scary because not only is it all of our personal information, but it's our social security numbers, right? And so at this point, you basically got to consider all your data is breached, right? And so we have to be thinking about personally, how do we monitor what's happening with our credit histories, our payment transactions, and really stay vigilant in this era of data breaches. Clearly, there's a lot of challenges, both for service providers, governments, institutions, but also for us as consumers at the end of the day. So we really need to come together as an industry and really start to rethink how digital identity and specifically identity verification is done. We need identity verification that balances security to protect those individuals and protect these institutions, but also allows for some convenience so that we can continue to drive more business into digital channels. I believe this starts with an open platform. We need to create an ecosystem that brings together all the different sources of truth around identity in a way that that information can be shared and a much more holistic picture of your identity can be used to measure whether or not it is you trying to do business and access a service at the end of the day. It doesn't just stop with your biographical information. It should also include your GPS history, your biometrics, your behavioral biometrics. Where have you been in the past? What are your behaviors? And bring all those 4 classes of attributes together in a way that can create a holistic picture. Also in this ecosystem, we need that fraud detection. So if something seems off when you look at that holistic picture, we can quickly raise red flags and find these fraudulent activities and stop them sooner rather than before they propagate throughout the entire ecosystem. And in order to do this, we really need a federated and interoperable platform that can service multiple use cases, everything from opening a bank account to going through security at an airport to accessing your email at the end of the day. And really, identity should evolve to not just being a big data exercise, but it should evolve to becoming a service. Identity as a service that can be used by all these different institutions. And then in order to address all these specific use cases, we have to make sure that this platform is pretty powerful in terms of being customizable and configurable to meet all the different regulations, as well as all the different just requirements that are involved in doing business. We also need to make sure that the consumer is front and center on this platform. And it starts with protecting their personal information. We need a platform where all that information is actually decentralized. It's no longer in one database that can be easily hacked by criminals. But instead, as Joe started to suggest earlier today, we need to actually decentralize all your personal information and keep it at the sources of truth, but find a way to bring it together using cryptography or tokenization and encryption so that you can actually verify an individual, but not necessarily bring all that data together in a centralized location. We also need a way to to have consumers only give as much information as they need in order to get access to a service. And a really great example here is, I think many of us are probably familiar with, is when we go into a bar and try to get a drink at a bar. Well, in order to get a drink, you have to prove that you're over 21, right? And when you go into a bar, they always ask for your driver's license. They're checking to make sure that you are, in fact, over 21. But when you hand over your driver's license, you're giving them your name, your address, your date of birth, and other personal information about you. When, in fact, all they really need to know is your picture or your face and connect that to the fact that you're over 21. But if that bartender is a bad actor at the end of the day and might be a little creepy, he now has your address and can come find you at the end of the night. Well, we need to be able to protect consumers by only providing information on a need-to-know basis. And then finally, for consumers, it's important that we give them the ability to revoke access to their personal data at the end of the day. Right now, if you are banking with a bank but decide you want to shift your business to another bank, you can close your account, but all your personal information still remains at that first bank, right? But we need to find a way where consumers can revoke access to some of their most critical information so that it's no longer being stored in a place that criminals can get access to at the end of the day. And then finally, just about user experience. I think identity has always focused a little bit more on security and not as much on user experience at the end of the day. But we really need to find a way to balance the two in order to really drive more digital services. And one way to do that is by focusing on a digital-first experience and mobile-first experience for identity, using those smartphones that we take with us everywhere as a way that we can continue to verify ourselves, whether it's using our biometrics, things like Touch ID, Face ID, or other types of behavioral biometrics that are now available on our smartphones. So that's my vision of the future and where I think digital identity really needs to go. And the good news is that we're seeing a lot of different types of organizations starting to move in this direction and really start to rethink the way identity is done in digital channels. Governments, for example, are taking many initiatives in order to issue digital identity credentials. They realize that we don't want to be carrying passports and physical driver's licenses with us every day. And they don't get us access to those online services as easily as potentially a digital credential. So there's various countries that are starting to issue national digital IDs, but they're using different models at the end of the day. India, for example, is taking more of a centralized approach, where they're trying to collect all the information about you and storing it in one single location. all your biographical information, your biometrics, and they're using that to issue your digital ID. And you contrast that with the likes of Estonia, which is taking much more of a decentralized approach. They are using one of the most advanced digital signature systems, leveraging blockchain technology to actually distribute all your personal attribute information, but bring that together to form a digital identity. And then you have other governments that are taking other approaches. Singapore, for example, has announced its intent to issue a digital identity, but they haven't really announced all the components or their approach to it at the end of the day. If you think about countries like the United States, Australia, the UK, I'm not so sure we're actually going to ever get to one fundamental digital ID. I think in many ways, these countries are going to rely on different agencies as well as states to actually issue different digital identities at the end of the day. In addition to governments, we're actually seeing the private sector trying to tackle this problem as well. And this chart is a little busy, and that's because it showcases that there's so many different types of organizations that are trying to solve various pieces of the puzzle, whether it's everything from biometrics to identity verification to maybe access management. The landscape remains very complex and very fragmented. And so while many are trying to push towards a new future, the challenge is in this fragmentation. There's not necessarily anyone bridging the gap or trying to create this holistic platform and working across different boundaries along with governments at the end of the day. And so it's going to take some time and consolidation to bring many of these efforts together in order to be successful. Finally, here at Thomson Reuters, I'm obviously part of the digital identity solutions business, and we are trying to rethink the way that identity is managed for our customers and as well as from various institutions. And we're trying to really drive those connections across all the different types of entities that we work with, whether it is those governments, financial institutions, corporates, enterprises, and find a way that we can bring all this identity information together and ultimately achieve one of these open platforms. So hopefully I've given you guys a sense of what is identity, some of the challenges that the industry is facing today, as well as hope that the industry is moving in the right direction, and hopefully we'll be able to solve many of these challenges over the next few years. So with that, I have some time, so happy to open it up for questions.
Well, maybe just a comment. So, you talked about the using your driver's license for identity. You talked about using your driver's license, and I'm really, particular about giving that information away as well. And one of the things that I'm actually going to look into is the passport card, which doesn't have any of your, information like your address and your date of birth, but it's issued by the same, organization that issues your passport, but it can be used as identity with a picture on it. So, I think it's probably the same cost as the passport, but something a little bit better for people to use if they're looking to avoid giving out too much information.
Yeah. I have one of those as well. I think one of the challenges with the passport card is, especially when you go abroad, it's not as accepted sometimes because not as many foreign businesses are familiar with these cards. But I think they're gaining in terms of traction and awareness. So I definitely see that as a good opportunity. One of the things I didn't touch on today, but what we're also starting to see is businesses and enterprises are trying to find a way to also digitize some of these documents. So you see a big push in this industry around how can you capture the information in the document, actually by physically taking a picture front and back, And there's a lot of new advanced technologies where it can actually verify that this is a legitimate document. And then using biometrics and the power of your smartphone, you can actually take a selfie and then match your picture to your document. So I personally feel like a document-centric approach isn't always the best way, but with new advanced technologies, we're also seeing a way to overcome some of the challenges as things move digitally. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious about what the challenges with biometrics themselves might be. It just seems like, in a way, like incredible. For instance, if you're at a bar, instead of pulling out your ID, you just show your thumbprint, because obviously, as everyone knows, there are a ton of people with fake IDs. It's definitely like a thing in college and even high school. So what about ways to verify, if you're going to the airport, oftentimes people, hopefully this doesn't happen, but forget your passport. I had a friend traveling to another country, couldn't find his passport. So if we had everything such as social security, birth certificate, passport, and ID all with a thumbprint or iris scan, etc., what are the challenges? Like, is it replicable? Like, can people actually steal your identity there compared to how we have with these cards and passwords? I'm just curious on that front.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when your biometrics are captured, it's usually a calculation. So it's not just like a picture, but instead it's using calculations and creating some sort of advanced algorithm or token that represents your biometric at the end of the day. And there's different models to how that's being stored. So some government agencies, some institutions are actually storing all that information in a centralized location, right? They're creating a big database of all your biometrics. And that makes me scared at the end of the day, right? Because just like the bad actors are stealing your biographical information, what if they hack these biometric databases and have all those calculations? Well, we can't all just like remove our thumbs, right? At the end of the day, well, then what's sacred? So I think what I firmly believe in is around the decentralization of that information. And we're seeing a lot of biometric software providers that are actually using that decentralized approach. So you would use your smartphone, for example, and register your biometric. And it's not all put into a centralized database, but instead it's encrypted, tokenized, and put in the secure vault on your phone. So if you lose your phone at the end of the day, well, then that's a challenge, or if someone can break into your phone, they have access to that. But it's not like there's one central place where many types of biometrics can be sold at the end of the day, or can be accessed at the end of the day. I also think one of the challenges, some devices are better than others. And if you read about biometrics, for example, there's a lot of spoofing tests that have been happening, right? So how secure is it? Can criminals pretend to be you? A lot of times there's these tests where people are putting masks on or holding up pictures and trying to pretend that they're you and get by facial recognition technologies. There is a trend now to something called proof of life, where it's not just a static picture that's used in facial recognition, but it's actually a video that's being run, and you have to do something like tilt your head or say something very unique at that point in time in order to prove your liveness.
Hi, I just wanted to flip this kind of feature that you're discussing. Yes, we are, let's say, going to be decentralized. And yes, we will place information into the hands of each individual user. Psychology, however, tells us that we're not rational actors in this system. We follow our impulses more often than we don't. And so we also have cases now where our digital devices with fingerprint authentication are no longer safe. If you decentralize, you literally create a database of itself. It's just, many of us. But we are a database at the end of the day. And if I can create a code, because there are only few operating systems that run on our devices, if I can create a code that hacks agnostically across platforms of those devices, what happens?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. I think that is a challenge. I think it's a balance, right? What we're seeing today is this trend towards attacking big sources of information because it's a way to get at a lot of information at once. As Joe touched on and as you're touching on, at some point the focus will transition to individuals. And I hope that technology will evolve to provide more advanced security on those devices or those databases at the end of by the time we get there. I think there are some interesting things happening right now around cryptography and encryption and just encryption in general. And so encryption and actually protecting that information to some level of certainty is actually very important, as well as the decentralization aspect as well. But there's no good answer for that yet. Great. Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to hand it back over to Gina at this point.